You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. If your social media feed is anything like mine, then you're seeing and hearing more about perimenopause and menopause than ever before. And yet, even though this is something that around half the world's population will experience, there's still some mystery around menopause, especially around what we can do to support people in this period of life and beyond. Well, long before the media frenzy, today's guest on the podcast was developing her own curriculum of yoga for menopause, evidence-based, responsive to the students' changing needs, yet respectful and inclusive of traditional yoga practices. I'm talking to Niamh Daly, a registered teacher trainer and Yoga Alliance continued education provider, nutrition coach, somatic education coach, and a qualified Pilates Mat 1 and 2 instructor. As well as training hundreds of teachers in yoga for the stages of menopause, Niamh offers continued education on yoga for bone health and menopause awareness for exercise professionals, as well as psychotherapists and counselors. She has also just released her book, Yoga for Menopause and Beyond. So let's dive into my conversation with Niamh Daly and shed some more light on this important phase of life. Hi, Niamh. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
It's such a pleasure, Rachel. I've been following yoga medicine for quite some time, and I really appreciate its evidence-based, balanced view and its honoring of the tradition of yoga all alongside.
Yeah, I know that's a delicate balance that you try to create in your own work as well. And I think that's, for me anyway, that's the really exciting side of the yoga world at the moment, is honoring the things that have been time tested for generations, but also looking to some modern science as well. And there's lots of excitement on either side of the spectrum.
There really is. And I think one of the difficulties regarding evidence-based yoga practices is that yoga is notoriously difficult to study. And so we are in danger when we look too much into evidence-based and of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think it's really important to recognize that there are some things that can't be measured by Western science. And also, as I say, because of it depends whether you are a very strong lineage-based teacher or you're more of a self-creating teacher. But if you are a more self-creating teacher, yoga can be so variable from individual to individual what's being taught. So that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to study. But I think it's one of the reasons why people get so supported and trusting of their yoga teachers, is because they are these creative, passionate individuals. And that's the beauty of it. And that's also good, as we'll talk about, may talk about later on, is that sameness is not great for health, and actually variety is great for health. So
I am something of a yoga mutt in the sense that I don't come from a really clear and identified lineage, and I'm pretty agnostic as to what I do as long as it works. And I think that varied experience of the thing that works for me might not be the thing that works for you, might not be the thing that works for the person over there, probably comes up in the topic that we're talking about today more than maybe anything else, which is menopause and perimenopause and that whole stage of life where individual experiences can vary so hugely. And yet the sort of outward presentation of that stage is It doesn't seem to acknowledge any of that individuality or complexity. It's one thing and one thing only, and maybe not even something that we want to talk about. So we are going to talk about it today. God damn it, we're going to dive right in. And it's been an area of passion for you for at least the last decade, to the extent that you have created teacher trainings and even written a book, Yoga for Menopause and Beyond. So I wanted to kick off by asking, what is it about this stage of life that really appeals to your, interest, excitement, that kind of enthuses you and has gotten you fired up for more than a decade?
Oh my goodness, what a beautiful question. So much, and I didn't realize when I began how passionate and enthused I was going to be. So it began when I started to notice my symptoms of perimenopause, and I didn't know very much about it, but I knew the word. So I knew there was something along those lines. And when I basically thought, oh my God, I'm dying, or oh my God, I'm developing early onset dementia in my mid 40s, as many women still have that scary experience. And I went to the doctor and said, oh God, what's going on? Give me all the blood tests. I was ignorant about what the blood tests might tell me. And indeed, they all came back, no, you're absolutely fine. The only thing is that there's a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone that's a little elevated. And I said, does that mean I'm in perimenopause? And the guy who was giving me the results was a junior or a student doctor or something. And he was like, oh, maybe. And I was like, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Because it just kind of gave me the answer that I was in perimenopause. Now, I have since discovered that that is not a defining blood test. And actually, it could have just been a complete coincidence. But it was enough for me. So then, knowing that I wasn't going mad or developing some mystery disease, I started to research perimenopause and saw how it could be incredibly well supported by yoga, and B, it also areas of it could be exacerbated by the way yoga is taught, not by yoga itself in terms of its rich intention, but definitely in the way yoga is taught. And I would say particularly in the West, and all the advertising around it as well, and the pictures that we see and the expectations and the language in certain. I'm also not lineage based. I love your word agnostic. I would also be a sort of a fairly agnostic yogi, and I feel for the people who are very deeply spiritual and yogis. That I may not speak to them, but that's me. Yeah, I just felt that in the very gung-ho lineage-based, some of the very lineage-based styles, there was a lot of potential for, I wouldn't, yes, sort of damage on a few levels. And I wanted to change that and enhance what yoga could be. And I wasn't that passionate about it to start. It was just, that's interesting. But to answer your question, now having worked with thousands of menopausal women, I'm in love with this life phase. I'm in love with those people because there's an awakening that comes with menopause that is like no other. And it strips away one's arrogance. It strips away one's sense of, oh, I'm immortal, I'll be young forever. It shows your life. It places it in front of you in a big image that you can't avoid. And not nursing is the wrong word, but supporting women through that existential transformation is a deep privilege, while also being able to make a little bit of difference to their energy or their joint pain or etc. So I'm mad about it, and this group is now my favorite people.
I love that description. And I love the fact that you kind of stumbled into it by accident. And I think this is a population, people like me, women in my age group and above, who maybe haven't been as recognized in yoga. I've heard you make the point before, and I couldn't agree with it more, that almost every yoga teacher training has something about pregnancy and how to teach a pregnant person in a group class, but no mention of teaching somebody in perimenopause or menopause and how you might tweak your teaching to make the practice more supportive for that person. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation, especially since I had definitely heard of menopause, right from when I was a kid. But even the phrase perimenopause was something I think I only really noticed, I don't know, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. I don't think prior to that it had struck me that menopause was a moment in time and that all of the symptoms that people talk about happen over a much longer period of time before and probably after that little blot on the calendar. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. That's
So I think
right. Yeah.
it's a sort of still kind of mysterious process, even though most of us understand the basics of what's going on hormonally. There's still a bit of mystery around it. And I wanted to ask you, there's so much more talk about menopause and perimenopause these days, at least on my social media feed, probably because I am the target population. Is there still stigma around being a menopausal person, somebody going through menopause? Is there still stigma around that people need help getting past?
Mm. I think there's a new stigma and a few new stigmas. So um, there is less of the old stigma, which is nobody wants to talk about it, which, as you say, you're seeing a lot about it. There's a lot more in the media. And in fact, there's so much in the media now, which really started to change around 2021. There was a documentary on Channel 4 in the UK, and anything that happens in the UK always bleeds into Ireland. We can access the UK television channels, so we were able to view it as well. And then I think it was talked about in the US as well. I'm not sure whether it reached you in New Zealand or whether it got to other English-speaking parts of the world. But it was important in two ways. One, it held menopause up to the spotlight and said, this is ridiculous that we haven't been talking about this. But it also was quite fear-mongering. It did start a lot of conversations, but it also created a lot of fear. So my job before that had been to help people understand that perimenopause existed and what it did and how they could help themselves. After that, it started to become more about trying to assuage their fears that they were basically going to pop their clogs within about 3 weeks if they didn't, do something medical about it.
Somebody in the
So,
States right now is listening going, pop their clogs, please
oh
define.
yes, okay. um, go 6 feet under. I don't know,
Kick
six
the
feet
bucket,
under. Is that kick the
punch their
bucket?
time
There you
card,
go. Punch their time card. I never heard that.
pass
That's
away,
fab.
glide over the rainbow bridge, whichever way you want.
Yeah, let's not use the D word, which we
Yeah,
probably will a little later, actually.
I'm sure.
Um, yeah, so there is loads more talk. So it has been destigmatized in a way, but
Mm,
I think it has been re-stigmatized in a different way. And that
mm.
different way is yes, I'm in menopause, but I'm invincible. I'm in menopause, but I'm carrying on as I've always done. I'm still working really hard. I'm still sexy. I have a great sex life. I'm still spiritual. I'm still doing a headstand. I'm doing the splits. I'm lifting heavy weights. So it's this new menopause narrative is that we can be menopausal and we can still um,
Conquer the damn
sort of
world.
ignore it. And yeah, exactly. And I see it a little bit now, not so much, and I haven't encountered this, but one of my teachers in a European country who's starting to really uh, do her own thing with yoga for menopause, she posted about it in a yoga Facebook group and she got huge flack. She said, how dare you say we should have to change our practice and or not have to. I don't think she was saying you had to.
Yeah.
And she was saying that, this was not yoga. This is some other stuff that you're talking about. If I change my practice, it's not yoga. And I
Mm.
feel like there's this for some people, there's a refusal, whether in yoga or anything else, to see that their body is calling for change. And I think that the yoga world is often resistant to change and kind of tends to sometimes hold itself up as perfect, and it's you don't need to adjust it for populations because it already just is marvelous. But we know that that's not accessible yoga and inclusive yoga. So yeah, yes and no. A different kind of stigma, I think. Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense to me 100% because I have this conversation with my partner sometimes where in some ways I'm really grateful to be in a female body because there are some really clear markers of the passage of my life. You know, puberty
Mm,
is more definitive, I think, in a female body than it is in a male, because there's a point where you begin menstruating, and that is like it's a line you cannot uncross. And it's the same thing with menopause. There is a line that, you know, it's going to be a little bit blurry for a few years, but eventually that part of my life will be over and there'll be a new part of my life. And people in male bodies, I think, don't have quite so concrete an experience of that phase has passed, this phase has passed. And that is confronting because we like
mm,
to believe that we're going to exist in the state that we're in now forever and for all eternity,
mm.
even though our logical brains know that's not true. And so,
Yeah.
one way or another, there's some stuff that comes up that you got to look at that maybe guys don't have to look at.
Yes. Absolutely. Very astute for someone who hasn't yet met this phase in your life. And that's what I was talking about. We will eventually talk about the D word. We were talking about going over the rainbow and whatever, all those phrases. So I think what perimenopause does is that it actually puts up in your face. I remember, I think the phrase I put it in my book is that as if some government somewhere sends you an officially stamped envelope with a letter inside saying you are mortal.
Mhm.
And so it's like we meet the truism or the truth that we will die. Whereas I think when we are in the buffer of estrogen and progesterone, which can make us really handle life possibly above capacity, but we feel like we have the capacity for a lot of things. We recover easily, we've boundless energy. I mean, of course, sometimes we don't have boundless energy in the menstrual years, but in general, it's a bit more bouncy. Um, and when we start to feel these changes in our body, and it might be stuff that feels like disease, even if we then get checked out and there isn't disease, and then we hear the narrative about the value of estrogen in our bodies and what it does in terms of health promotion. It can be a time of existential angst where we suddenly go, okay, I actually am going to get old. And if I'm going to get old, that means I'm also going to die. And that is huge. That is like a big part of what yoga teachers are holding. And they're maybe holding it without the women even themselves knowing that they are feeling this existential angst. They are feeling uncomfortable. They don't have the questioning to figure it out, the self-questioning to figure it out. And that's a principle of yoga that I think is really important in yoga for menopause, is self-study and figuring out, what's going on for me. So they don't, maybe teachers may not know they're holding this kind of depth of difficulty for women. But if the teacher can kind of guess that it's probably there, at least as an undercurrent, and hold it really gently in a non-confronting way by talking about health, talking about aging, talking about um, comfort in life rather than longevity, that just about feeling okay as you move through the years, then they may help start to assuage the fears of those women or make it feel less of a sting without having to face into it. And in a circumstance that might not be appropriate, they might need to bring it to their psychotherapist if it comes up. But I think some of the discomforts women feel in menopause are not because of the hormones, they're because of the thoughts that come in because of how the hormones are making them feel physically. And so they want a quick fix for this existential angst, but it's a human truth.
Mm.
There is no pill for that.
A couple of things have come up as I've been listening to you on this train of thought, and the first one is that as well as it being a passage of time, an ending of one stage of life and the beginning of another, um, for me, having never wanting to have children and never having children, every month has been a bit of a relief. I'm not pregnant, yay. But I know that
Mm.
that's not the case for many people who menstruate. And the end of your reproductive years is also the end of any possibility of there being a child or another child. So there might be that kind of subtle sense of grieving or loss of potential as well. So
Mhm.
there's that. And I guess that starts to bring up in my mind some of the physical and physiological and mental impacts of perimenopause and menopause. And we hear about the hot flashes and night sweats and brain fog and every single symptom under the sun through the itchy skin and you name it. The one that I wanted to start talking to you about was my favorite in your book, which was the influence of hormones is one thing, but it can bring a person to the point where things that were tolerated are no longer tolerated. And so this person might get to the point where the way things have been for the last 20 years that they have been managing, they are now not willing to manage. And I find that a kind of exciting and
Mhm.
potentially really positive point for a person to get to, because some of the women that I've worked with who've been in that phase of life have been balancing kids who aren't quite adults yet with aging parents or siblings who need extra support, and they always seem to be the last person on the list, the bottom of the barrel. And it's almost as if this is the trigger to get to the point of, I need to come closer to the top of the list. I need to do some things for me. And that's
Yeah.
powerful.
It is. And, firstly, I want to say that before I talk about that whole piece about wanting to come to the top of the list or deserving to come to the top of the list, to really hold in our awareness people for whom that kind of self-care is just not accessible for whatever reason, for financial reasons, for supportive family reasons, and that discussions about self-care are privileged discussions. And we are very fortunate to be able to even think about this. We're very fortunate to be able
True.
to even have this conversation. But that said, yes, it is. I think what this is a complete theory of my own is that instead of menopause being a time where we have reduced capacity for all those things that you have listed, I think it is a time where we recognize our true capacity.
Mm,
Whereas before we have been running at above capacity, but we have had this buffer that has stopped us burning out or that has somehow, kept us being able to do it and also driven to do it, Rachel, because,
mm,
for example, estrogen supports the function of oxytocin in the body. So if you're not having that bonding hormone, you're going to feel less tolerant of your partner. If you have kids, you're going to feel less tolerant of them, maybe just even less of that caring nature. Like, you want me to cook your dinner? Are you mad? It's really, it's quite remarkable how
my
it's
poor
like this
partner.
sort of, yeah, exactly. It's like a sort of veil gets taken. We talk about veils in yoga. It's like a veil gets stripped from your eyes, and you see the insanity of what you've been doing without the support. I think that's we could go into a whole discussion about different ways of living and living in community instead of in one box, because I think if we were living in community through menopause, then maybe other people would be coming up and taking up the slack for us when we're starting to go, ugh, what are those children things? And instead we're, the only people in the house with those kiddos needing the minding. So yeah, I think that's a real aha moment for women when they recognize that oxytocin is reduced or the effects of it are less evident. Serotonin also, actually, menopause is definitely not just about the sex hormones or the reproductive hormones. Um, I want, yeah. What was the phrase you used about tolerance or the, you used a phrase in this entire question that I can't
Well,
remember.
things that were being tolerated are no
That's it.
longer tolerated. Yeah, which is me paraphrasing you in the book, which I just read and I
Yes.
loved. I was like, yes, more women need to get to that point where things that they were tolerating are just not
Yeah.
today. Unfortunately, I was
Exactly.
born that way. So I hope for my partner's sake, I don't get any more so. But a lot of women, they put up with a
Yes.
lot. They keep saying, yes, of course, yes, of course, yes, of course, until the tank's empty.
Yes, and it's interesting because I'm sure you know of that tend and befriend nervous system response that we can have the fight or flight, and that's the one that men tend to go into, but women also have that setting in their nervous system where we can go into tend and befriend and fawning. So we're kind of going, no, it's okay, it's all right, and just make friends with the aggressor, and it's all about our modus operandi, our nervous system modus operandi is to calm the waters. When we get to menopause, the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the stress response can be heightened. So we are actually, our nervous system is behaving differently. We're more on what you could call a hair trigger. Sometimes I think that menopause kind of, how can I say, brings us more onto an equal footing and has the potential to help us understand people who are in male bodies, because if you think about what we would have maybe criticized in men, they're too quick to anger, too quick to action, they don't consider things before they act. That's often what menopause feels like. And it's like that the gift of estrogen that people people in male bodies haven't had has meant that that those bursts of anger are really hard to control because they are part of their hormonal nature. So it can be a time of understanding, helping to understand um, that gender if one can be bothered thinking in that direction. But maybe you've got bigger things to be considering. But yeah, the window of tolerance gets smaller, or the boundary of tolerance gets smaller. But what bothers me is that there's currently a term which I find just so patronizing, which is meno rage, MENORAGE, and it's making the rage women feel at this time a bad symptom, and it's making it it's patronizing it. And I definitely work with people for whom rage that has no perceived stimulus is a major problem, and that this, the red mist comes down within an instant and it's really uncomfortable. But what I also hear is women using awful phrases of themselves like "I'm the bitch from hell" and hating themselves
Mm.
in ways that you can see are devoid of looking into the rage and what's behind it. And actually, I help them try to see what of their rage is justified and what of their rage may just be hormonal surges. And in the kind of, I suppose, I don't know how to use this term, maybe the conscious community, people who live, asking questions about life and themselves, they're seeing that this is a rage from decades of nonsense that they've put themselves through. It's rage against the patriarchy, it's rage against society, um, and maybe even rage against themselves for putting up with it, rather. So I really think there's space in the yoga world and self-study to appreciate that anger, but it's not one that many people want to do, not in the yoga world, because we're supposed to be Zen all the time.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with the toxic positivity narrative, does it? To have rage. I mean, rage to me sounds like a long-term extension of the old, oh, it's that time of the month. That must be the reason why you're grumpy. No, I'm grumpy because here are my expectations and they weren't met. So yeah, I can respect that. So we've talked about some symptoms of that stage of life that aren't the ones that we tend to see all the time, the hot flashes, the brain fog, the night sweats, all of that sort of stuff. Anything else that you want to kind of draw out to make people aware of that isn't often spoken about as a potential experience for people in that stage?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is important. I'll talk about a couple of things here. One is self-esteem becoming um, burdened or more difficult to feel, and that was one of the first things that drew me to do yoga for menopause, was because I was hearing reports of people who were practicing in their yoga class, and they were up the front row, giving it socks. And then as they started to feel the change in their body, they start to move back in the studio. But then really sadly, some people were talking about how they then left because it just
Oh,
didn't feel relevant to them anymore. Because their body was changing, they were feeling a change, a need for change in their practice, but they only could see it as a deterioration of their practice. And they didn't have a skilled teacher being able to say, actually, no, this is a phase where your practice does need to change, and I have some ideas for you. So it was a one size fits all situation where, yeah, I mean, they may not have talked about it to their teacher. I wouldn't say it was the teacher's fault for not having the skills, though the teacher may, after doing a course like mine or reading my book, they may be more likely to. I'd give cues, little things to say in a room where mostly they're, whereas mixed ages, and they might be in their 30s and 40s, to just drop little things in, so the woman who is moving to the back row might go, ah, and then have a bigger conversation with the teacher and look for more support. So self-esteem, because of a perceived reduced ability to do all sorts of things, their exercise, to stay on top of their work, forgetting things, etc., how they look is a big thing. So there's a lot of angst about how do I look. And one of the chief problems reported about hot flashes or hot flushes is people will think I look weird, I'm embarrassed. Not I'm uncomfortable and I'm too hot, but I'm embarrassed about what people will think of me. So thinking around the symptoms is an important part of the learning, I think, for supporting menopause. And then um, health worries. So that would be something that it's not in the list of symptoms, but because there's so much narrative about health concerns that can, the risk to certain areas of health that can be increased because of a lack of estrogen, or areas of health that are supported by estrogen, for example, and progesterone. And also people mistake that symptoms mean there's a health problem. So a lot of women are just holding from perimenopause and for the rest of their lives terror about their bones, terror about their heart, terror about their brains. So while we need to know that these are areas that need more care, we also need to know that they are all things that we can address, and that there are only a certain percentage of people who will be affected by those things, and not everything happens to everybody. And if menopause caused people to die, everyone would die very quickly. And if menopause, was definitely going to make you have cardiovascular event or osteoporosis or Alzheimer's, then every woman would have them. And we see that only 20% of women, for example, develop Alzheimer's. Now, that's a large number compared to men. And that's a big, big part of, as you read in the book, I'm really interested in brain health and maintaining brain health. But it's not a shoe-in. Is that a word? Is that a phrase, a shoe-in? It's like it's an American-y thing where you say it's like not definitely the case that
Yes, yeah.
because you've done menopause that you're going to get this disease. So
Mm.
I think that's a really important part. And for me, that's part of satya, the truth of things in menopause, is that it is not as black and white as it's being portrayed. It is not as disastrous as it's being portrayed. And teachers need to know the middle ground truth that is out there if they know where to look, because on social media, that's not where we see the middle ground truth. We see the polarization. And then the last thing in terms of that question, I would love to, oh God, I'm looking at my notes that I wrote because you asked me a little bit about physical, psychological, and emotional symptoms. And there's two more I'd like to address. One is, I'll just say it briefly, often we get this sense of, what is my life for? Actually, this can tie into the next one, which is about libido changes. So in relationships and in work, we can start to wonder, what am I here for? It's a time where that really comes up, because, as I said, we start to see, oh, okay, am I gonna, this is me knowing that I actually am part of the normal lifespan, which is from birth to death. So what am I here for? And in relationships, that it's quite confusing, because some people will have an increased libido in the early stages of perimenopause, or the stage leading up to that, which is a big part of my trainings and book, The Late Reproductive Stage. But what can also happen is, within that increased libido, they can find themselves, if they are in a relationship, looking outside their relationship to other possible sexual partners. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. If we were not in the society where where we're supposed to stay with one partner, we might have multiple partners through the years. And in, I think, most species, there's very few that mate for life. Every time you mate, you look for the youngest, healthiest partner to create, hopefully, the healthiest offspring. So I can see that is evolutionarily logical, but it's really uncomfortable for people. Perhaps they do still love their partner, but they're feeling this yearning, and it's very confusing. Nobody talks about increased libido in perimenopause, which isn't the majority that feel it, but a lot of people experience that. And it's sort of in work as well. In work relationships or in the workplace, it's like sitting up and going, oh my God, I don't want this anymore. And in the media at the moment, the empowered woman narrative is, don't let menopause make you leave your job. You've got, the workplace needs to figure it out so you can stay there, which is fine if you love your job. But what about, let menopause help you see that you need to leave your job because you haven't loved it? So it's these kind of awakenings to change that the world doesn't want us to listen to, because it wants to keep us on the hamster wheel in our nice little neat package of relationship and our neat package of work and career and retirement. And I'm not encouraging people to leave their partners, but I am encouraging them, if they're feeling those itchiness, that itchiness, to look into it. It may be, I think for some people, they'll leave their partners for the wrong reasons, because they're not recognizing what the itchiness is from. And then for some people, this happened to me, it gave me the strength and the sense of urgency to leave my partnership, because I was going to just tick along till I was 80 and go, I never really was in the right relationship, was I? And when I got to perimenopause, I was like, I'm not going to sit with this. Actually, I've got a precious life to live.
Well, I'm
That's a
certainly
lot of
hoping.
answer to your question.
No, I love it. And I love the fact that you've brought up a lot of symptoms that I don't see in social media posts, and that are much less easy to handle. I'm certainly hoping I never have to have a conversation with somebody in one of my classes about their sexual desire. I'm really hoping I never have to. But there's some really juicy stuff there about the new stigma of menopause being almost its medicalization, and how that can stem real fear in people, how people can be experiencing rage that they're not accustomed to feeling, some of which could be stemming just from hormonal changes, and some of which could be stemming from real precursor life repression of what they actually need and what they actually want. Change, I think, is scary for everybody. It's scary for the person precipitating it. It's scary for the people around them, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't sometimes need to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a nutshell. I wish I had just said that instead.
Well, I
It was
mean, we
so
can
quick.
certainly edit that. We can certainly edit that.
No, 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 I'm only kidding. Just in terms of your succinct way of bringing together what I've said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
great.
think
Yeah.
this is, and maybe this is why when I was a little kid, it was just referred to as somewhat ominously the change, because it
Yes.
is a time of enormous change in the way you're describing it, not just physically, not just hormonally, but psychologically and almost psychically, your perception of
Mm.
your place in the world, what you're willing to do and not willing to do. And that can be uncomfortable for not just for you, but for the people around you. Mm.
Yeah,
So when it comes
absolutely.
to yoga practice, let's talk about the physical practice first of all, and then move on to talk about the more subtle aspects of yoga practice. When it comes to yoga practice, what might need to change for somebody going through late reproductive stage, perimenopause, menopause, and beyond? And knowing that for each person, it's probably going to be a little different, but what are some of the things that we might want to think about or pay attention to?
Yeah, fabulous. So there are loads and loads and loads of physical changes. And one of them is, well, some of them are that there are certain areas of the body that are more prone to injury in menopause. We're seeing this Achilles tendon, anterior cruciate ligament, rotator cuff. Those are areas that seem to be quite vulnerable. There's a lot of changes, obviously, in physical. Well, no, I shouldn't say obviously, maybe listeners won't be aware of that, that there's reduced collagen in the body. And that means that we are less tolerant of mechanical stretch. Particularly in the pelvic floor, for example, the type of collagen changes, or not just completely changes from A to B or 1 to 2, but there is a certain ratio of types of collagen in the pelvic floor in the menstrual years, and then there is a shift, and there's more of the stiffer type of collagen in the pelvic floor in peri and post menopause, which means that it is not as responsive to mechanical stretch. Which makes sense if we're coming to the end of the phase where the pelvic floor needs to stretch. If the person is going to give vaginal birth, actually, I hadn't thought about that. We see a tendency for people to injure more quickly and recover more slowly, and that's not important just because we don't want people to be in pain, but it's incredibly important at a time of life where staying active is immensely important to reduce the loss of bone, to reduce the loss of muscle mass. So when you have an injury, you have to pull back from any activity, whether it's asana or running or whatever it is you're doing for that area. You can do other stuff, but injury tends to make people, whether they need to or not, stop everything or stop more than they need to. So avoiding injury becomes more important.
And for
Um,
mental health as well, if you want to give a vent to that frustration or that fear or that anger, for
yeah,
me, that's very much from moving my body.
it's massive. And actually, now that you talk about it, you've seen in my book that I have a really strong focus on strength. And in the media at the moment, there's a huge focus on women need to do heavy lifting. I don't think they need to do heavy lifting. And there's caveats to that, and I talk about that in my Yoga for Bone Health trainings. But I, the value of muscular strength is so varied. So you're saying, yes, there's a mental health value to exercise, but the value of muscular strength is really varied, or really rich. So for instance, we know that people who have more awareness of their muscle strength and more muscular strength do better in terms of anxiety and depression, which are major symptoms of menopause. We also know, and this is still being investigated as to why, that people who have stronger core strength are more have more regulated nervous system response. There's something about the studies are now looking at the fact that there's a lot of communication between the sensory motor cortex that connects to the core muscles, and that area is also highly connected to the adrenals. So I find this fascinating, that if you
Mm.
have better core strength, you're likely to be more able to go into the parasympathetic. Might be to do with the vagus nerve, but that's not what they seem to be seeing. It's directly affecting the adrenals. Then we also have less cartilage. So cartilage is reducing. So the likelihood of if you're overdoing a posture, a far range of motion posture, like, you know, a deep lunge, or maybe even if you're someone who likes to get into a bind or put their leg behind their head, that kind of very gymnastic stuff, you're more likely to then be pressing on cartilage. And I'm sure you know, but maybe all the listeners don't, that cartilage doesn't have nerve endings, which is why our bones don't hurt when we walk and when we move. We don't have this pressure on something that has pain receptors. So we don't know when we're damaging cartilage. We don't know until it's already damaged. And so if we have thinner cartilage or more unevenly thick cartilage, and we bring our body into fuller ranges of motion again and again and again, it's much more likely that we may create a labral tear, a tear of the cartilage inside the hip socket, for example, or we may just end up with osteoarthritis, where the cartilage gets worn away much quicker than it would in an average lifespan. Now, people can develop osteoarthritis without doing yoga. Of course they can, but we do need to stay mobile, incredibly important, but and yoga can really help with that. But I would say that we need to be thinking about not pushing for big end of range of motion postures. I would say that we need to be also acknowledging that there is a lot of aches and pains, just general overall aches and pains, tendency to slightly higher inflammation, which can decrease the joy of asana. So making the asana pleasurable and achievable feels like a more, I was going to say kinder, and I'm afraid to say it because we'll get people going, oh, I don't want to dumb down my yoga practice. I want to still do my handstands, and handstands are fine if you've got strong wrists and your balance is okay. And we want to avoid falls big time. But yeah, I think a kinder, more pleasurable, you've read the book, pleasure is a big piece for me, practice is maybe valuable for the inflammation, for the aches and pains, and it tends to bring us back from accepting pain if we're looking for pleasure, because the nervous system is hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So if we decide that our asana practice is supposed to feel pleasurable in the moment, not afterwards we feel great because we've done it, but actually, is this moment right now pleasurable? And I'm not talking about the slightly skewed relationship we have with pain, where we feel pleasure in the pain,
Like that
pleasure in the
hurts
push.
so good.
Exactly. If we can go with the pleasure, then we might be neurologically more inclined to feel the dodgy pain and go, oh, I'm going to pull back from that. So we need stress, we need intensity. We need intensity and positive stress for our bones and our muscles and our mobility and our brain health. But we also need to be much more responsive to our nervous system saying no, whether that's on a physical, mental, or emotional level.
I love
Does that
that.
make
And
any
you
sense?
100%. And you have already highlighted the fact that that's not a popular message on social media, because certainly on my social media feed, I see one of two extremes. One is you got to be lifting heavy, you got to be lifting heavy now. And the other side of the equation is if you're in that phase of life, you should just be doing restorative. That's all you should be doing because your nervous system needs nourishing. And the truth, obviously, is somewhere in the middle. Sure, you should be lifting heavy things with good supervision. Sure, you should be soothing and nourishing your central nervous system. But there's all of that stuff in between about practicing in a way that makes you feel strong and stable and capable, and cultivating discernment over, does that feel good? Does that feel awkward? Does that feel interesting? Does that feel, is that pain? Is that different to the other side? Is that different to what I felt yesterday? All of that really rich territory in the middle that yoga is so perfectly positioned to serve for us, that can feel good in the moment and can also really give us the owner's manual, as Tiffany would say, of this magnificent thing that is our body, getting to know it better, even as it's changing.
it's essential to get to know it better as it's changing. And I think
Yes.
because we're kids until we reach menses, and then we have all those menstrual years. And I think in our 20s and 30s is when we really start to develop a sense of who I am, what my body loves, what it needs. And then when menopause comes along, it's like, I don't want to have to reinvent who I am and what I need. I want to go, most women say they want to go back to where they were. And that's where the resistance that I was talking about at the beginning, when you asked, is there still stigma? That's where it comes from, because they don't want to accept the need for change. Because it's like, oh my God, do I have to do all this now? Do I have to do all this figuring out and shifting? But it's also like my sense of identity is really wrapped up as it happens in those decades when I was in my menstrual years. So it's a big old shift. I'm just going to dive straight into another little piece that just remembered about asana practice. And you were talking about late reproductive stage, perimenopause, postmenopause. There are slight differences within those phases that can be focused on. For example, movement in general in the late reproductive stage and early perimenopause to keep the liver functioning and the bowel moving is really important, because we can have high levels of estrogen that need to be processed by the body, whereas the physical difficulties may not be present then. They may still feel really fine in their asana practice, very much the same. Whereas we get into the thick of perimenopause, then hormones are lowering more. They're still spiking and lowering, the estrogen in particular. And then there's different cortisol happening. There's different melatonin. There's different FSH. There's lots of different hormones, the feel-good hormones too, which have symptoms attached as well. They're shifting too. But that's a time when there is more likely aches and pains, and things are like bones are starting to reduce a little more, bone mass is reducing a little more quickly. That's the time where we might see more need to adjust the asana practice to be more a bit kinder to the body, a bit more what feels good. And I'm very much into functional asana, as in, would I do this in real life? Does it help me in real life? Because when we start to look into perimenopause and menopause, for me, yoga for menopause is also about yoga for the rest of your life. And I want women to be able to be independent in their older life. And then when we come into post-menopause, most of the symptoms are gone. Women are feeling emotionally stronger. And then it's all about looking after bones, heart, brain, and pelvic floor. And so I would say to really work on balance challenges for your students.
My favorite.
Ones that are not just a little easy tree pose in a nice quiet yoga studio, but just adding some stuff that really challenges balance and more real life kind of vibe. And work that really, asana that really promotes strength, but languaging it as well, Rachel, because you can, I teach my people some stuff in warrior, and then they go away and they say warrior 1 helps bone density and builds strength, but it doesn't if you're just kind of hanging out in warrior 1. You've got to add some isometric contraction in there. You've got to, maybe you can hold your bolster above your head, or even if you don't want to use any props, you can think muscle into more action than they ordinarily give. You can move more slowly on your mat to make more balance and muscular demand. So there's ways of, from the book, I do add resistance bands, not to all my classes, just to my yoga for bone health classes. I know that yoga isn't good enough to keep us as strong as we need to be. And it can be a really good gateway into doing lifting at the gym. But yeah, those different phases are about different kinds of, I love this word, eustress, EU stress, positive stress, or more reduction of stress. So perimenopause would be more about soothe the nervous system. Postmenopause is more about, right, let's make sure we're keeping things on their toes, pelvic floor, brain, bones, heart. Yeah.
I love that. And that's the population that I work with, mostly people in their 60s and 70s. And I had a conversation with one student recently. I went on a really unpleasant day of my period, and I apologized because I was feeling like us. And she said, oh, yeah, oh, I'd forgotten all about that. And
Yeah.
that was to me a real positive, like, oh, there's life on the other side where you completely forget about the challenges of the reproductive years. So there's pluses
Yeah.
and there's minuses. And I think you've already started, to me at least, heading into the direction of some of the more subtle practices, because our approach to asana is, our approach to everything. And if we take the real Western mindset of there is only one way forward, and that is progression, harder,
Mm.
stronger, faster, more productive. And any step backwards from that is back down the ladder towards death. It's not different, it's not change, it's worse, it's less than. And that to me starts leading into the place where yoga can be really powerful, whether that is meditation, pranayama, whether that is yoga philosophy. So let's talk a little about the impact that those more subtle practices can have in this stage of life.
Yeah. Well, I think I can quickly kind of go through the philosophy piece because I've talked about satya and I've talked about
Mm,
self-study. That we are, as teachers, we're making sure we can unpick the truth from what women are facing. I do a CPD for psychotherapists as well. And one of the things that I'm trying to educate them about is what the women who come to them are seeing in the media and what's confusing them, what's not truth, so
yeah.
that they can help them navigate that. So for a teacher to be able to unpick, and it's hard, like
Mm-hmm.
the strong media push of, like, currently it's testosterone will cure everything, whereas before, and it still goes on, estrogen will cure everything in terms of supplementing it through hormone therapy. And I am not anti-hormone therapy, just to be very clear, but there is some unfortunate, how should I say, fluffing up of the feathers of HRT in general, or hormone therapy in general, that is based on single studies rather than multiple studies. And what the medical world guidelines want is multiple studies to be able to recommend anything. But some very strong voices who are medical voices are um, promoting things that we don't actually truly know yet. They may
Mm,
become true, but we don't truly know them yet. And it's really hard for people, teachers or individual lay people, shall I say, or practitioners, or just people who aren't even interested in yoga, to unpick those things, because you have to understand studies, you have
mm,
to understand endocrinology, you have to understand media, you have to understand so many things. Um, so for teachers to find the person that can help them know the middle line is immensely important, so that they can be delivering truths. That's also when it comes to making claims about what yoga can do. And Rachel, there are some really highly respected teachers in this, in the yoga world, making claims for individual yoga postures as relieve symptoms of menopause, this one posture. There's zero research to indicate that, and some of them are unsafe for people with osteopenia. And we know that 50%, just over 50% of women, the statistic is from the US, have of women over 50 have low bone density, which is called osteopenia. More fragility fractures happen in women than with osteopenia than with osteoporosis. So that means over 50% of your students over 50 are vulnerable to fragility fractures.
And maybe
We
even
need,
more in the yoga population, where we tend to have really low body mass, and people who aren't
yes,
necessarily in the gym, they might be using their yoga practice as their movement practice. So it could even be higher than 50%.
you're the first person who said that to me. I've always been wanting to say that and afraid to say it, that I
Mm,
think it's possibly higher in the yoga world. Also, it is highly populated by Caucasian women who
mm.
are also more prone to osteoporosis and osteopenia. I can't remember why I brought that in about the truth of it. Anyway, the
Or
point
the
is that
outlandish claims that people make about the single yoga
yes,
pose. Yeah.
Thank you, because some of them are often contraindicated for osteoporosis and osteopenia, for fracture risk. And they're saying do a shoulder stand. Shoulder stand relieves symptoms of menopause and whatever other, stops hot. That's not one, stops hot flashes. That's not one that they said. But that's the point. Some postures are being claimed to do all these little things. And doing a shoulder stand with that flexion in the neck is highly dangerous for someone with an osteopenic spine or an osteoporotic spine. And no contraindications given. It's fine to say stuff and then say, but don't do it if, but it's not even there. So speaking truth to me is, as a yoga teacher, is about not making false claims. Hugely. And that is one of my most passionate pleas to teachers, particularly in menopause, because women are going, please give me the answer. They are in distress and need. And if you tell them that testosterone has the answer, or shoulder stands have the answer, or yoga, even in total, has the answer, it is not truth. Every study into yoga for menopause is inconclusive or okay at best, but there's bits that it just doesn't seem to help. So that is, in terms of the philosophy, it's also from ahimsa, because you are doing harm if you are giving false information or information that you can't back up. And this is coming full circle around to the beginning of the conversation where we talked about evidence-based. I will often to my teachers use the phrase until we know more, because we may have the absolutely magnificent and best answer for menopause in yoga, but we don't know. And maybe reclining cobbler does balance your menstrual cycle because it pulls on your womb. I don't think it does, but maybe we just don't have the research yet. What?
Yeah, but we don't know that yet.
Exactly, yeah. So the research we have in yoga for menopause is, it's not very targeted. It's just, does yoga in general help? There is one study into a mixture of the information support method, where you also give people education about menopause and menopause symptoms. You tell them that it's not the end of the world, and you tell them how they can help themselves. And then yoga added into that seemed to work very well. I haven't researched what I have developed, and I would love to, because it's also then adding other tools and taking away ones that I think might be difficult, but adding tools from outside. Also, we've talked about self-study, so I think we've kind of covered that in terms of the philosophy part. But ahimsa in word and in deed, to ourselves and to our students as either practitioners or teachers. And then with regard to things like pranayama and meditation, pranayama is, there's so many things where I say, it's probably our best tool, but it has had a good bit of research for menopause, particularly only in a Western context. So I'll give you English names. They've researched paced breathing, which is 6 breaths per minute, which I have to say most yogis, myself included, find too fast, 6 breaths per minute. But they seem to be finding that 6 breaths per minute works for sleep, anxiety, and hot flashes in menopausal women. And by the way, if you are interested in research and looking into research in yoga, please make sure that the research was also done on perimenopausal women, because what works in a woman in her 20s or a man in his 30s, etc., very often doesn't work for perimenopause. Particularly sleep is really hard to support. So that's a goodie. We also have research that Kapalabhati has good results for pelvic floor health in postmenopausal women, which is great. Bastrika helps with lung capacity and lung function, can reduce in menopause as well, which is like not great news, but Bastrika is particularly effective. What we don't have evidence for is Sitali and Sitkari cooling or easing hot flashes. And this is
But
really
it's
interesting because
such a good quick Instagram post, though, having a hot flush,
isn't
cool
it?
yourself down with this tip or technique.
I know,
Damn
it
it.
really bothers me. I know. And it probably, as I say in my book, it is beneficial because it will feel nice. Just like
That's the
taking off your
thing.
sweater
I
feels
mean, that's the
nice.
truth of it, isn't it? Is to say, have this tool in your toolkit, it might be helpful. It's really different to saying
Yeah.
this will banish hot flushes, which is not true. But to say this might feel nice, pop this in your toolkit, pull it out if you need it and it feels beneficial. That's a truthful way of sharing a technique that people might benefit from.
Exactly. Yes. And that's the languaging I use all the time. And talking about popping it in your toolkit though, what we do see with everything, pranayama in particular, is that we have to practice it to then for it then to have effect. So I wouldn't say in that the way we've just talked about Satali Satkari, that's fine to just pop it in your toolkit because it feels nice. And even when you do it, if you've never done it before. Whereas something like paced breathing or deep yogic breathing, we see much better results when it's done on a daily basis for quite a lot of time. Maybe time poverty doesn't allow this, but 2 patches of 15 minutes or a few patches of 5 minutes, so quite a lot of breathing practice for it then to work in a triage situation where you're like, oh, I'm hot flushing, I need my 6 breaths per minute, or oh my God, I'm going to a stressful meeting. So it doesn't work unless you've practiced, which is yoga, right? Um,
Damn it.
and then yeah, I know. And then getting on to meditation just as a last piece, unless there's more you want me to talk to. Um, I would tend to be very much about taking the sting out of meditation because of the self-judgment that comes in with people who meditate, who inevitably are frustrated because it is not an easy thing to do. And we still have this idea that we can stop thinking by meditating, whereas actually trying to invite people into a compassionate relationship with their mind by recognizing that the human mind is designed to think into the past and the future. So of course we're thinking a lot, and just to come back to the anchor, come back to the anchor. But also I would tend to use meditation, which is not really yogic, maybe more in line with yoga nidra somehow. I would use guided meditations a lot to try and help people's perspective shifting, which can really help, like guided meditations about one's expectations of oneself, guided meditations about feeling space around you at a time where you feel claustrophobic by all the demands made of you. And then also, I think what kind of slots into meditation and also another yogic practice is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very like Pratipaksha Bhavana, which I hadn't heard of it until I came to yoga for menopause, because I knew CBT was good, cognitive behavioral therapy, and I was desperately trying to find an equivalent in yoga. And Pratipaksha Bhavana is basically something that we do, but I hadn't heard the phrase, which is the induction of more positive thoughts. So replacing negative and catastrophic thoughts with more positive. But with CBT, it's not moving to the positive, it's moving to the neutral. So instead of, oh my God, I'm falling apart, turning into I'm at one with the universe, it's, oh my God, I'm falling apart, turns into I'm okay, I've managed a situation like this before. So CBT has lots of research around it for the support of menopausal symptoms. And it's the one holistic practice that is always recommended by the British Menopause Society, the North American Menopause Society, the NICE guidelines. It's right in there in terms of the level of research around it. I hope that's answered some of what you were interested in.
I feel like we could have a million conversations. I feel like, and maybe we will have future conversations to drill down into details. But a lot of stuff has come up for me that feels fresh. Like I said, I've heard lots about night sweats and hot flashes and brain fog. I've heard lots about the medicalization of menopause and the fear that it engenders about heart health and brain health and bone health. But I haven't heard conversations around self-esteem and fear and anger and frustration. And I think as adding nuance to the situation is always helpful. Having conversations that we're not hearing a lot of, I think, is always helpful. And I'm starting to get the feeling that there'll be people listening who might want to set up a class series or a special group for women in perimenopause and menopause who want to come together and share what they're feeling and share their experiences and to benefit from really specific practices. But in the meantime, if we have those students in our classes, it could be just as simple as teachers of changing our language. And we've done a bunch of podcasts on taking away the hierarchy and providing people options. If you want to feel more grounded today, do X. If you want to challenge your balance today, do Y. If you want to feel more supple today, try Z, instead of, if you can, do this, and if you can't, clearly you're a failure, do that. We've had lots of podcasts on that topic before. So come back to that really inclusive language, take the hierarchy out of it, and give everybody a place where they can find the level of challenge that's appropriate for them today in the body and the brain that they've brought to class. So maybe for today, we leave it there, probably with lots of interest from people to learn more. So if they want to learn more, where shall we send them to find more about you and what you do?
So I decided to give, because my name is difficult for people to pronounce internationally, I didn't call my website Niamh Daly Yoga. So I decided to choose
for those of you who are phonetic.
Yeah. Yeah. And so instead I chose another word that nobody can pronounce or remember, which is yinstinct, which is instinct with a Y in front of it. So Yinstinct Yoga is the name of my website. And that was back from a time when I was developing, and I still use it as sort of yin infused hatha. So it was bringing a little softer edges to the practice and more about the emotional and health aspects of yin, but also about exactly what you're saying, that empowerment to move as feels right for you in the moment. And so in all my practices, there's a moment of self-led movement in all my teaching. It's not long because people get terrified, but it's in there. So they can find me at instinctyoga.com, and I do teacher trainings, as I've mentioned a couple of times. And then they can also Google my book, which is how they might, and that's on the course. You need that for the training. So if they're thinking of doing the training, it can be a nice little segue in, and it won't be a waste of money. So that's called Yoga for Menopause and Beyond, and it's available pretty much everywhere in terms of finding it online. Yeah, and I work with not just teachers, by the way. So I know you have some listeners who are not teachers as well, and I work one-to-one with women and do online classes and whatnot.
Brilliant. Well, we will link to that. We'll link to your website, your social media, your book for people who are interested in reading the book or doing some ongoing training. We'll also link to previous podcasts on osteoporosis if your interest was piqued on bone health, and on balance if you were like, how would I incorporate more realistic balance challenges, and to the yoga medicine female health training if you want to know more about the background of those hormonal changes and how we can support them from a TCM as well as a Western medicine perspective. So there'll be lots of resources in the show notes for people who are keen. But I want to finish by thanking you so much for bringing your energy, your enthusiasm, and your passion for this stage of life. And hopefully it's gotten some people excited about letting that red mist come down, kicking ass and taking names, saying no to some stuff.
Too flippin' right. Yeah, absolutely. I really hope it, sets the fire in you to move into your perimenopause and postmenopause in a way that is not all about defeat, but is actually more about it. It's a delicate dance between lots of different things. Of course, you will feel challenged, but that you will also feel the potential of it. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Niamh.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.